Okay, so we have state of nature, inefficiencies, protective organisations, dominant protective organisation, and we've got this problem with the independence. And as I say, I don't think that he can solve that problem. But anyway, what we're going to do now is we're going to just move on, pretending that he could solve the problem, or perhaps you can solve the problem, or someone else could come along and solve the problem. What we're going to do is talk about Nozick's theory about justice in the state. So imagine that we've got to the state now, we've got to a minimal state. We're going to talk about justice in the state, in part because Nozick's arguments about this are powerful independently of his position on the independence. So even if he's totally wrong about the argument about the independence, he's got powerful arguments about the state that we need to look at now. Okay, and here's a slide that captures this. In fact, if you're watching this lecture, it might be good to have this slide in front of you, to keep it in front of you. As always, you can download this stuff from Blackboard. Okay, so he's got justice in the state, and his theory of justice in the state has three elements: justice in acquisition, justice in transfer, and justice for past injustice. And they're connected with three arguments that he presents: Wilt Chamberlain, Pareto, and compensation. This will become clearer as we go through his position. Okay, justice in acquisition, justice in transfer, justice for past injustice, Wilt Chamberlain, Pareto, and compensation. Okay, so here's an argument for justice in acquisition. That's his Wilt Chamberlain argument. An argument for justice in transfer. That's Pareto. And justice for past injustice. That's compensation. Okay, so let's go through this now. Okay, so we need to start with Nozick's Wilt Chamberlain, famous Wilt Chamberlain argument. Now, who the hell is Wilt Chamberlain? I wonder how many people listening to this, watching this, will know who Wilt Chamberlain was. Wilt Chamberlain's a very famous basketball player. Was, anyway. I mean, perhaps no one remembers. I mean, many people watching this won't remember him, but he was a very famous basketball player. I mean, I don't know who the equivalent would be now. Basically because I don't give a toss about basketball, but you know, Kobe Bryant would have been, and Michael Jordan would have been recent comparisons. I mean, obviously one's just died recently and the other's retired, but you know, hugely famous basketball player. Okay, and what Nozick says is, look, let's just imagine a situation like this. We have people who played basketball. Chamberlain played for the Lakers. And let's just imagine that Wilt Chamberlain enters an agreement with the Lakers. And the agreement is that, you know, when people come along to the Lakers, what they will do is they'll pay their money to go and watch the Lakers. You know, let's just say it's in the 70s it was $10. Who knows how much? It was no idea, but let's say so they pay their $10 to the person at the gate to get in to watch the game, and they also put a quarter, 25 cents, in a box. So they pay $10 to go to the team, and they pay an extra 25 cents that they stick in the box, and the money in that box goes to Chamberlain. That's the arrangement that Chamberlain has made with the Lakers. So people come along, they pay $10 to get in, and they put 25 cents in a box, and everything in that box goes to Chamberlain. Okay, now the key thing to notice about this is that there's been no coercion here. Chamberlain has entered into this contract freely with the Lakers. Both sides are happy with this situation, right? There's no coercion involved. They're both happy. Everyone who comes along to watch the game does this freely. No one has been forced to go along. You know, if people didn't like the arrangement, they could stay home, watch it on TV or whatever. But no, they go along to the game and they happily pay their $10 and put the 25 cents in the box. Everyone's happy. Okay, but over time, Wilt gets rich, right? He accumulates these 25 cents. I mean, it may have to be more than 25 cents these days probably, right? But over time, he keeps accumulating this money, and he gets richer and richer and richer. And one day maybe he becomes incredibly rich, right? He starts buying these mansions at Malibu, and he has a private plane, and whatever. Okay, now we're inclined to say, and people like Rawls are inclined to say, oh, this man is exceedingly rich. This is unjust, right? This is, we can imagine people today, the lead up to the election, saying that the existence of this wealth in a single person's hands is an example of inequality and therefore unjust. But Nozick says, in response to all of this, he says, where's the injustice? Where's the injustice here? What we have is a freely made agreement between Wilt and the Lakers. It's totally free. They enter into this arrangement completely freely. No one has been coerced, right? And people come along and watch the games, and they happily pay their $10 to the guy at the gate, and they put the 25 cents in a box. No, everyone's doing this. Where's the injustice? Find the injustice in any of this. Different story, of course, if Wilt was sort of holding a gun at the gate and saying, give me 25 cents or I'll shoot you. But it's not like that at all. These are all completely free transactions. People enter into it willingly. No one is being forced. Where's the injustice? Sure, it results in a situation where Wilt is richer than the average person, much richer than the average person. But there's no injustice here. This is just the result of free voluntary transactions. Now, I want to point out what's really powerful about this. Is a very powerful argument, and what's really powerful about it. The thing that's really powerful about this argument is it undermines a traditional left-wing criticism of the market, of the free market. The traditional left-wing criticism of the free market goes like this. It says, look, it may be true that people operating in a free market, they're all voluntary transactions, everyone's acting freely, it's all contractual, it's all Pareto efficient. But what happens is that some people get a lot richer than others. And the reason for that is because people have certain advantages in the market that they don't deserve. For example, they might inherit wealth from their parents, or that their parents may have been able to educate them to pay for education that other people haven't been able to have. So we have all these unequal starting positions, right? And we go into the market. On the face of it, the market is a level playing field, but we all start in different places. Some people have advantages over others, and lo and behold, it turns out that we end up with unequal outcomes. We can't accept those. The traditional left-wing criticism of the market is we can't accept these inequalities that the market produces, because the inequalities that the market produces are reflections of the inequalities that people have brought to the market in the first place. Okay, some people have a head start in life. That's the argument, right? Some people have a head start in life, and when you enter into this apparently level playing field free market, it turns out that the people with a head start come first. No great surprise. That's the traditional left-wing criticism of the market. And Nozick undermines this by saying, okay, well then adjust the starting positions to be whatever you want them to be, right? Adjust the starting positions so that everyone's equal, or whatever you like. Adjust them in any way that you like. The point is that if we allow people to enter into the market and then transact freely, some people will end up wealthier than others. Okay, some people will end up with more than others. Okay, that's his position. Okay, so the point is that, and a slogan for capturing his argument is that the slogan is liberty upsets patterns. Liberty upsets patterns. So in other words, you start with any pattern that you want, make it everyone enters to the market in position of absolute equality, whatever it is you want, whatever pattern you like, pick whatever pattern of that you think is the most just. If people enter into the market on the basis of that pattern and they transact freely, the result will be inequality. Okay, liberty upsets patterns. Whatever pattern you like, if you give people the freedom to transact freely, then what will happen is that pattern will be disrupted. Right, liberty upsets patterns. And there are various examples that one could point to show this. For example, in Poland and Czechoslovakia, when these countries finished with communism and entered into whatever we want to call it, capitalism, free market, whatever, the state's assets were distributed equally amongst people. And what happened was that some people sold their assets, some people bought their assets, some people bought a whole lot of assets and created businesses out of them. And the result is that some people in Poland and Czech Republic and Slovenia and so on, Slovakia, now are wealthier than others. So they start from relatively equal position, but some people have ended up much wealthier than others. Liberty upsets patterns. Now, the converse of this is to see, and again, this is something that Nozick really wants us to see, that the only way to achieve equality is to constantly apply coercion. Okay, and again, I think this is something that we've kind of forgotten today. Now, maybe Nozick's wrong. Maybe equality is more important than he thinks. Maybe the state is justified in producing equality, but surely his point is right. This point is right, at any rate, that the only way to achieve equality is to constantly apply coercion to people, because liberty upsets patterns. Okay, and again, I think we ought to be at least more careful about that than we are. That doesn't mean necessarily we should do less coercion. That's a different argument. We could talk about that. But what I'm saying is that we seem to live in an age where we don't really give a damn about coercion. You know, we just coerce people all the time. As long as we think it's in the common good, we just do it. And I'm not saying that only people on the left do that either, right? I think all the mainstream New Zealand political parties are quite happy coercing people. But Nozick would say, at the very least, we shouldn't be as carefree about that as we are. Okay, so liberty upsets patterns. If you want people to be inequality is the price of freedom. That's another way of thinking about this. If you want to live in a free society, there's going to be inequality. Right? You're just going to have to accept that. And so, as a result of this, it's not obvious. Even if you think equality is important, it's not obvious where the balance between equality and freedom should be. Now, Nozick thinks we should forget about equality and take freedom seriously. Whatever, maybe he's wrong about that, but the point is that we need to think about both of these things and realize that we can't have both. We can't have complete freedom and complete equality. We can't have them, because the only way to achieve equality on a long-term basis is to constantly apply coercion to people. Okay, liberty upsets patterns. Now, note in the Wilt Chamberlain example, if what we did was we took some of Wilt Chamberlain's wealth and redistributed it to other people, what would happen in this case, says Nozick, is that we would be, in effect, forcing Chamberlain to play basketball for other people. Right? Just think about that again. If we take some of Wilt, what is Wilt Chamberlain's wealth? It's this 25 cents that people are dropping in the box for him. If we take some of that money and give it to other people, we are forcing Wilt to play basketball for other people. And that's a kind of forced labour. Okay? And Nozick's saying that's what we do with taxation all the time. Taxation is a kind of forced labour. Now, when I first came across this view, I thought this is really interesting, a really interesting reversal of Marx, right? Because, Marx has this kind of idea that a lot of the work we do is forced labour too. But then I actually thought, I don't think this is a reversal of Marx's idea at all. I think this just is Marx's idea. It's just that Marx applied it to the capitalist, whereas Nozick's applying it to the state. And I think, in fact, Marx and Nozick have the same view here, in fact. Marx would say that the capitalist is exploiting us. Nozick is saying that the state is exploiting us. They could both be right. Okay, that's something to think about. Okay. All right, so the Wilt Chamberlain example deals with justice in acquisition, but it also deals with justice in transfer. Okay, and we can see how Pareto comes in here as well, because everybody who comes along to that game is willingly paying the $10 and willingly putting the 25 cents in the box. That's a Pareto efficient transfer, right? There's nothing Pareto, no one's forcing anyone. This is a free transaction that the parties are entering into. The system, if we don't interfere with it, is Pareto efficient. It's only when we come along and start taking money from Wilt and redistributing it that we disturb the Pareto efficiency. Okay, all right. So the only alternative is coercion. All right. Now, what's more, Nozick says, another reason why we shouldn't be redistributing Wilt's wealth is if we are going to redistribute Wilt's wealth, we can only do so on the basis of some conception of what a just pattern of wealth would look like. Okay, so if I'm going to take money from Wilt and give it to other people, that must be because I've got some idea in my head about what a just distribution of wealth would look like. But here's the thing, says Nozick, we all disagree about what that would be. Right, I might have in my own mind an idea about what a just distribution of wealth would look like, but you'll have a different idea, and Wilt will have a different idea, and everyone has a different idea. And the question is, how can you justify forcing one of these ideas on everybody else? I mean, think of the current of the Labour Party's policy. The Labour Party's policy is that tax should be increased at the top tax rate to 39%, if I'm remembering correctly. Okay, but that's just their idea. I don't think that's right, actually. I mean, what I think is complicated and so on, but I don't think that's right. But if they win the election, they're going to force it on me. Why should they? What gives them the right to do that? Now, you might say democracy gives them the right to do it. No, democracy just says Nozick, democracy just gives them the power to do it. It doesn't make it legitimate. It doesn't mean it's the right policy. Right? Right? It means that they have a democratic mandate for doing it, but it doesn't mean that the policy is the correct one. It doesn't mean it isn't immoral. Right? Governments do things that are immoral all the time. Why should this be any different? Okay? All right, governments don't make justice. Right? The democracy doesn't make justice. Democracy is a different thing. It's not about making justice at all. Okay, so Nozick says, when we redistribute wealth, we do so according to a pattern, and the idea that that's the just pattern is just forced on everybody else in society, and that's unjust too. Okay, all right. Now, there's another interesting thing about Nozick's argument that I thought I should raise here, and that is that he doesn't think that that past injustices can be justified. Right? Now, that might be a little bit odd thing to say, but you'll see why I put it that way in a minute. You can't justify a past injustice on the basis that it's had good consequences. Right? He's not a utilitarian, right? If there's a past injustice, you have to correct it. Right. Now, what that means for Nozick, and he's quite explicit about this, is that he thinks huge tracts of land in the United States need to be returned to the Native Americans, right? Because that land was... Now, be careful about this, because he's not saying... He's saying the land that was taken coercively needs to be returned. And indeed, land that was taken under what in common law we recognise as duress and so on, probably that needs to be returned as well. He doesn't say... He wouldn't think that the land should be returned if it was bought for much less than its value or anything like that. Bad bargains. No, bad bargains. That's not an injustice, right? And indeed, as you know, that's the common law. Well, as many of you will know, that's the common law's position too. But land that was taken coercively needs to be returned. So large tracts of the United States need to be returned to Native Americans. Now, then they could be purchased again, right, if it was done consentingly, but it needs to be returned. And indeed, you might think, obviously, his argument would apply the same way in New Zealand. It needs to be returned, or if it isn't going to be returned, a compensation deal has to be offered to which the wrong parties will consent, because that's a kind of consented to sale. Okay, so... there's an element of Nozick's theory that's not often thought of. He's often thought of as a kind of extreme right winger. He's obviously conservative in all his political views, but it's not really true. In many ways, he's and a lot of these philosophies cut across the traditional left-right political divide. I mean, he would be very sympathetic to Māori claims to confiscated property and so on. Simple position, they should be given back, right? Or unless, of course, the government can enter into some negotiations with the wronged parties to which they willingly consent. Okay, another thing about Nozick that I think is very significant is that the book is called Anarchy, State and Utopia. And the third element of this, the utopia, anarchy and state, we know all about. Anarchy is what the hell are we going to do in the state of nature? State is the minimal state. What's the utopia? And this is the bit that normally gets ignored from Nozick, but I think he's got a very interesting conception about what an ideal state would look like that doesn't get enough discussion. One of the reasons that he's arguing for the minimal state is that he wants people within a state to be able to form their own associations and to belong to those associations voluntarily. And he wants to be able to create a society in which there would be lots of difference and where people could form very different kinds of social associations and belong to if they chose to. All right, so that's his idea of utopia. A state, imagine a huge country like the United States, would consist of a whole lot of associations with very different values, and people could choose which of these associations that they would choose to join. So it's a society with a great deal of diversity, where people would join particular associations based on the values that they shared with those associations, which would be different from other associations. Okay, and this is why his focus on freedom, his libertarianism, is so important to him. One of the reasons it's so important to him. He says if you have a minimal state, right, if you have a state that does very little, you give people the ability to form their own groupings with their own values and live in their own ways. Okay, now one of the reasons that I think this is so interesting is because I think this is very different to the kind of world in which we live today. I think we live, as I've mentioned in the past, a very conformist society where we have basically one way of living, or maybe a few ways of living, and we're constantly fighting over what that one way should be. So, for example, this is one of the reasons that there's been so much heat in and there are totally legitimate reasons for this, but in the Black Lives Matter movement, the Me Too movement, there's now, of course, the movement about the incorporation of tikanga into the common law and how that's going to be reflected in universities and so on. And one of the things that's interesting about that debate to me is the debate seems, at least if I've got it right, and maybe I'm misunderstanding, right? But the way I see it, it's about which way are we going to require everyone in New Zealand to live? That's the subtext of the debate. Now, Nozick says this is the wrong way of organising a society. It should not be trying to work out the one way that everyone is going to have to live. It should be trying to work out how the state can be organised so that people can choose all sorts of different ways in which to live. Right? So if you want to live in a religious community, you go and live in a religious community. If you want to live in a sort of rationalistic community, you go and live in a rationalistic community. If you want to live in to take some examples relevant to New Zealand, a sort of traditional iwi-based Māori community, you go and live in that community. But if you want to live in a European, much more sort of European Western community, you live in a Western community. And when I say live in, I'm not talking about necessarily dividing the country up into regions. It might be that my neighbours, they're Indian as it happens, but let's use that as an example. Let's say they're Indian, and let's say they choose to belong to a community in Auckland where the traditional values of a Hindu society play a very large role, and I choose to live in a different community, but we live next door. That's fine. There's no problem there. Or there may be a few problems, but the job of the state is to work out how we live with those problems. It's not to try and work out what we all have to be together. It's to try and allow us to form our own collections, our own groupings, and live as we choose to within those groupings. So, and indeed, maybe you can live in more than one, right? So, I could be a member of more than one grouping, but that would be up to us. We could form our own communities, our own little communities within the wider New Zealand society, right? And that would be important to us. Now, of course, some of this does exist. There are church groups and so on that play a very important role in people's lives. But Nozick's idea is that is that the state should get out of our way to enable us to form more of these. And indeed, he thinks we would find more meaning in our lives in this way. Now, I have to say for myself, I find this view very attractive. I mean, it is a kind of utopia in both senses of the term, both in that it's attractive and also it's it's a pipe dream in a way. But the question for me is this something that we should be trying to head towards? Because I think we're heading in the other direction. We're heading towards a much more homogenous society. We're heading towards a much more conventional, a much more unified society, at least in terms of its values, where it's very difficult to exist. I mean, it's very difficult to exist in New Zealand society today if you don't share mainstream views, although the mainstream views, I suppose, do vary a bit. And it's just one thing in Auckland and it's probably a slightly different thing in Utopia or wherever. But nevertheless, it's different. Like, for example, this is not true about me, right? But let's say that I was totally anti-immigration. Now imagine, or let's say, for example, that I had religious beliefs, traditional religious beliefs, that meant that I was opposed to gay marriage. And imagine that I made that public. I think it would be very difficult for me to continue. Now, I don't have either of these views as it happens, but right, why am I being so careful about this? Because I'm worried that if I actually did have those views, I think it would be very hard for me to continue as a professor at AUT University. At a university, of all places, where we're supposed to celebrate diversity, but we don't, because we celebrate only some kinds of diversity. We're very happy to have people of all different sexual orientations at AUT, but you have to have the right attitude towards sexual orientation at AUT. You're not allowed to be a professor with conservative moral views about sexual orientation, for example. Now, as it turns out, I don't have conservative views about sexual orientation, but nevertheless, you see, there's a point there, right? The point is that on the one hand, we say we celebrate diversity, but on another hand, we actually, not only do we not celebrate diversity, we insist on there being no diversity. Right? There is a certain acceptable moral view, and if you step outside that, right, then you're deemed to be unacceptable, right? And as I say, I think it would be if I did have conservative views about things like immigration and sexual orientation and so on, I would find it very hard to live within this particular community. All right, so this is just an idea. I think, another example of this would be when Israel Folau came out with what I regard as unfortunate comments, a year or two ago, and there was this huge furore. And I think about, Israel Folau, he's an Australian rugby player. Why do we give a damn about what he thinks? He's not even a New Zealander, right? He's an Australian, and he plays. Why should I care about what rugby players think about morality? Why do I care? Why should I care about that? But we seem to live in a community where everyone is supposed to care about what everybody else thinks. Right? I personally would rather live in a community where we say, Folau, he thinks that, does he? Oh, okay, all right. What was I doing? I'll get back to my real life. And we just don't care about Folau. We just let him live in his community and leave him alone. Right? We don't feel that we have to make sure that everyone believes the right thing. We just accept that people are different. Anyway, that's the utopia in Anarchy State and Utopia. And Nozick's position, which is surely right, is that if we were to ever achieve that, we would have to have a state that would interferes less with us. Maybe not quite the minimal state that he's talking about, right? But it would have to be a state that interferes less with us. I mean, just think, whether the current government is good or bad, I don't want, but one thing is absolutely clear. The current government do feel that they have not just the right, but an obligation to be quite invasive in our lives. And maybe that's justified with the way things are at the moment in the world. But not only invasive in terms of saying that we have to stay home when there's an outbreak of COVID, but also in how we ought to think. I mean, we're told all the time that we should be kind, be kind, be kind, be kind, be kind. maybe 50 years ago we would have thought that was brainwashing. Anyway, I'll just leave that with you.